So yes, okay. So Angeliki will be recording, and then we can share it. We can share it online. We can share it in our websites. The university.
Most useful.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I mean, we can now. I see Giorgos. Welcome. So Angeliki can have the honor of opening the seminar series, and again we can proceed.
Okay, then I will begin. Good evening, dear colleagues, dear students. I would like to welcome you to the series of seminars entitled The Balkan Between Empires, which is being launched today in the context of the courses on the history of Slavic peoples that I teach at the Department of History and Archaeology of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and the Middle Ages, an economic and social history taught by my dear colleague, Mr. George Theotokis at the Ibn Khaldun University of Istanbul, with Professor Georgios Kardaras as the first speaker. We hope that the seminar series will be the beginning of a fruitful cooperation between the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and the Ibn Khaldun University of Istanbul. We are particularly happy because the chairman of the history department of Ibn Khaldun, Professor Khalil Berktay, is with us today, and I will hand the floor to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angeliki, if I may. It's great to be here with all of you. I'll be very brief. Just as Angeliki Delikari has just said, we are also, for our part, looking to this cooperation with great enthusiasm and with great hopes for the future. We hope it will develop into many other things, like maybe student exchanges, faculty exchanges, whatever. We have a department that, of course, concentrates on Ottoman and modern Turkish history. There is so much in common. I shouldn't say in common, but there is so much that overlaps and interacts, of course, between modern Greek history and modern Turkish history. And of course, you at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, you have a great expertise in the medieval and Byzantine Balkans. So we are in like an ideal position of mutual complementarities. And we simply hope that we will keep on with this and that this will become more and more intensive, more and more frequent. And I would like to express my personal gratitude to both Giorgos Theotokis and Angeliki Delikari in taking the initiative in creating this seminar series. Let's look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank both of you, both Angeliki and Professor Khalil Berktay, for their encouragement. And first of all, I would like to thank as well Angeliki in particular, because it was her idea. I have to stress that it was her idea to arrange for this seminar series that we are hoping it will be taking place once a month, hopefully every third Friday of every month. And after Giorgos Kardaras, we have invited Marek Meshko also to talk about a very particular topic of of the history of Byzantium and the nomads in the Balkans. And again, it's a great honor for me to be with you, even in this virtual world. And I would like to invite, as our first speaker of this seminar series, Giorgos Kardaras. Giorgos is a senior expert and a senior researcher in the history of Byzantium and the nomadic world in the Balkans. He began his career at Ioannina, from where he got his PhD, and then he was a junior researcher and then a senior researcher in the very prestigious Institute of Historical Research based in Athens. And he has published extensively on Byzantium's relations with its northern neighbors, on the history and the culture of the early Slavs, the history and culture of the nomads in Eurasia, and of course, Kiev's Russia. And his latest collective volume, which he edited, he contributed, and I also had the honor to contribute to this volume, about the history of Kiev and Russia. And it was published a few months ago by the publishing house of the Institute of Historical Research. So, Giorgos, thank you for being with us, and we are looking forward to listening to your topic on, again, the invasions of the nomads in the Balkans in the early Byzantine history. So thank you very much, and the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, I would like to thank very much Professor Angeliki Delikari and Dr. Georgios Theotokis for the kind invitation. I wish every success to the seminar you organized, and I hope that with your next guests, we will have a very interesting cycle of lectures on the topic you choose for this seminar. So I have to start my presentation, namely an outline of the barbarian invasions in the early Byzantine Balkans, and after this outline we could have a discussion about the topic. So I will use a PowerPoint. I hope you see clear the PowerPoint at this moment. Okay.
Yes, we see it.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so a short introduction about the 3rd century. It's a time of crisis for the Roman Empire, and this crisis was not only economic, but also social, demographic, and things became worse because of barbarian invasions, not only to the area we are dealing with today, but also to the western frontiers, to the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire, I mean along the Rhine River. So many barbarian invasions started already in the 3rd century, although we used to speak for the beginning of the people's migration in late 4th century, but actually many raids and invasions took place earlier. So to what is more interesting for us, I know that in the 3rd century, people like the Goths, the Carpi and the Heruls were already northern neighbors of the late Roman Empire. The Goths in modern Ukraine, linked with the Cherniakov culture, Carpi, neighbors of them in Moldavia, and the Heruls by the Azov Sea. And I just note here some dates since 217 are recorded, the first Gothic raids, and then other raids of Carpi and the Heruls. As we know, the Heruls attacked also in 267 to Athens, and they destroyed the city. Furthermore, an Iranian nomadic people, the Sarmatians, had settled in southern Romania, and in the 4th century they occupied the eastern part of Vojvodina, lost for the Roman Empire, as after the Sarmatians this area passed to the Gepids and after them to the Avars. For their invasions, the barbarian people used a road network in the Balkans, constructed since the Roman era, and this road network helped also their movements to the south. Indicatively, I note some major of these routes. First of all, they used valleys of great or even smaller rivers, Danube, Sava, Drava, Morava, Timok, Iskus, and many other rivers on the Balkans. The most important roads, the so-called Danube Road along the Danubian limes, covering the area from Singidunum to the Danube Delta, actually to the south, along the southern part of the Danube, because the northern bank belonged usually to the barbarians, except of some Roman and early Byzantine later bridgeheads that the empire tried to keep for control also to the northern bank, and but actually the northern bank usually belonged to barbarian people who were already occupied. So this road continued after to the Danube Delta to the south along the Black Sea coast, the western seaside of the Black Sea, and arrived to Constantinople. Another very important way crossing the middle part of the Balkans was the so-called Via Militaris. Tsaritsyn later, it's a way that constructed after the Danube Road, started also from Singidunum, but going direct to the south, arrived also to Constantinople through Viminacium. I mentioned just the most important stations, the Valley of Morava and Nisava rivers, Naissus, Serdica, and Philippopolis. And also for moving to the west, the barbarians used many times the road from Singidunum to Aquileia, it's modern Venice, close to modern Venice, the ancient Aquileia, through Emona, modern Ljubljana, and the Sava Valley. So, having a look to separate people, we could start with the Goths in the 4th century. After the Pest accepted by the Huns, in 375, they abandoned their homeland in Ukraine, and they moved to the west and south and southwest. Their choice, mostly for the Visigoths, was to cross the Danube and to ask permission from the Byzantine Emperor Valens to settle on the Balkans. The Byzantine Emperor accepted their demand, but 2 years later he fell fighting against the Goths to the Battle of Hadrianople. After these battles, the Goths had all the free space to do raids on the Balkans, both to eastern and western part of the peninsula. And later, the Ostrogoths managed to control a part of the Balkans, establishing their kingdom first on the Balkans before to their migration to Italy. So we have a first formation of an Ostrogothic kingdom on the Balkans between 473 and 75 on Western Illyricum. Then they are moving to eastern provinces of the Balkans, and what is more known is the Gothic kingdom of between 475 and 88 under Theodoric the Amal, his dynastic house, but he's the better known maybe to us, Theodoric the Great, who in 488 migrated to Italy, and he established there an Ostrogothic kingdom, having first succeeded victory over Odoacrus. Being ruler of Italy, Theodoric expanded his rule also to the Western Balkans, namely the Roman province of Dalmatia, reached up to the river Sava and Drina, and he controlled also the greater part of Pannonia. The Ostrogoths lost these territories in circa 535 namely at the beginning of the Ostrogothic War, when the Byzantines attacked to the Ostrogoths in order to reoccupy Italy, as did earlier with the Vandals in Northern Africa, in the place of the so-called Reconquista, in the frame of Reconquista. After the Goths, a very dangerous enemy, although for short time, was the Huns. The Huns migrated first to the southern part of modern Romania, and they established the first hegemony there from the beginning of the 5th century up to 420-22 about, and then they migrated to the Carpathian Basin, where they established a very strong kingdom, which for 3 decades was a great threat for both the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. The peak of this power marked the reign of Attila, a very capable and ambitious nomad ruler, who raided first in Byzantine territory, 2 great raids in 441, 42, and later 447, caused destruction of the most important cities in both Illyricum and Thrace, namely Western and Eastern Balkans. I mentioned some cities here, and to a temporary collapse of the Danubian limes. The Hunnic raid later, after these dates were transferred to the east, we know about the great invasion in Gaul in 441 and the Battle of Catalavnian Fields, which marked the end, the gradual end of Attila's power. And after his 3 years, when he was already died, his kingdom was collapsed. After the collapse, as we said, of the Hunnic kingdom, as Mark pointed, we have for this the Battle of River Nedao. It's an unidentified river in Central Europe. The former subjects of the Huns, namely mostly German people, like Lombards, Gepids, took the upper hand in the Carpathian Basin. Here we see a map considering the middle of the 6th century. We clearly see with the green color the Gepidic kingdom east of the river Tisa. The Lombards. The Lombards covered the former Roman territory of Pannonia. The Slavs, Sclavenes, are on the territory of modern Romania before their settlement south of the lower Danube. And also the other branch of the early Slavs, the Antes, we have their position north of this, of the place of Sclavenes, but actually in modern Romania, both Sclaveni and Andes were settled. And Kutrigurs, as we see, it's the zone north of the Black and Azov Sea. It's the steppe land which the nomadic people used to live. And also Sclavenes north of Lombard and Gepids. Actually, in the middle of the 6th century, they had expanded to a part of Central Eastern Europe, not the total area, but at least for Poland up to the eastern bank of Vistula, it's testified their expansion, but it's ambiguous if they have already expanded in modern Slovakia, maybe some first waves, but not dense settlements. and somewhat later in modern Czech Republic. We can see the situation also to separate cases in the era of Anastasios and Justinian regarding the early Bulgars, as we showed to the map earlier with the yellow color, tribes like Kutrigurs and east of them the Utigurs. They are considered as early Bulgar tribes. Other scholars attributed them a Hunnic identity. In any case, many times the Byzantine authors used an umbrella term, Huns, for all these people coming from Central Asia to Europe, having common ethnic and cultural features. So Byzantium accepted also raids from these tribes, mostly the Kutrigurs, and these raids was also disastrous, mostly between the raids of between 439, 440 and 445. They affected much the area of Illyricum, the Western Balkans. And the attack of Zabergan, ruler of the Kutrigurs, in the winter of 558 to 59, which crossed the Danube with his army, and at the final stage of his attack, he divided his army into three parts. One of them, he led this part to against Constantinople. The other part attacked to Hieronessos in Thrace, and the other part raided farther in the Greek peninsula. Justinian managed to repel them outside of the walls of Constantinople, but he found the solution to the problem with these nomadic tribes through the payments. So paying the one tribe to attack against the other. Finally, he managed to destroy their power in a very clever and diplomatic way, as Agathias describes in his history, actually the policy of divide and rule. About the Slavs. The Slavs, since the early 6th century, as we know from Procopius and Jordanes, but Procopius' testimony is more precise on this case. They have settled already on the northern bank of the river Danube, namely in southern Romania. Actually, they occupied all the area north of the lower Danube, and they started their invasions to south of the river. As we said earlier, we distinguished the two branches of the early Slavs, Antes and Sklaveni. But for Antes, less are known because they have shorter time of mentions in the written sources. In any case, we could distinguish the Slavic raids in two phases. The first one, since between 518 and 552, where we have participation of both Antes and Sklaveni. Actually, the Antic raids stopped in after the Byzantine Antic Treaty in 545 or 46, but the Sklaveni continue up to the 7th century to raid on the Byzantine provinces. For this first phase, we have very often raids and also transfer of population from the Byzantine provinces north of the lower Danube. The Western Balkans were most affected by the Slavic raids of this period, namely Prefecture of Illyricum and province of Dalmatia. mostly between 546 and 52. To what considered as very important for the block of Slavic raids, we have a temporary interruption about 25 years, from 552 until 576 or 77, is the fortification work of Justinian, which covered not only the Danubian limes, but also all the interior of the Balkan Peninsula. And it was really a great program of fortifications, because actually Byzantium could not provide much of troops on the Balkans. The involvement in conflicts to the west with the Ostrogoths, as well to the east, where wars with Persia was also very often, left no room for sufficient presence of Byzantine troops on the Balkans. So Byzantium had two choices. One was the fortifications, and the other through the payments to avoid the raids from other people. The nomads had also contributed to this attacks of the Slavs. We said that the raids of the Kutrigurs were temporary with the Slavs in the first phase, but regarding the second phase, from 576-77 until circa 626, where it was the siege of Constantinople by the Avars and their alliance. The Avars had a decisive role to the movement and the attacks of Slavic tribes, because many Slavic attacks took place in collaboration with the Avars. I just note the date of some important raids, the first 556 or 57 or 77, and the other is a mention of John of Ephesus about 3 years attack of the Slavs between 581 and 84. In any case, the mass Slavic settlements on the Balkans took place in the early 7th century, although after 580 there are settlements of first Slavic emigrants, the first waves, but not a dense settlement. These dense mass settlements came after the turn of the 6th to the 7th century, after the year 600. The Avars, also maybe the most dangerous enemy with the most destructive raids, considering all the early Byzantine period, because they established a very, the Avars established their own Khaganate in the Carpathian Basin, and because their excellent military organization, they could keep for a long time a threat for Byzantium for many decades. And because of this capacity and the threat they constituted, they managed to gain incredible amounts of gold as yearly tribute. It considered about 6.5 millions of gold coins, regardless the loot or other possibilities they had to take the Byzantine gold. So it's a short outline of some events, attacks, and negotiation with the Avars. Actually, before the establishment of the Avar Khaganate in 568, they had very short, very not important activity against Byzantium. Probably one attack in 562 is linked with the Avars, but after the occupation of Sirmium, after the occupation of after the establishment of their Khaganate, they had as first target the occupation of Sirmium, because Sirmium was a Gepidic possession, and the Avars, as they subjugated the Gepids, they considered also the area of Sirmium as their own, belonging to them. And Byzantium, at the time when the Gepidic kingdom was ready to collapse, did the right movement and took the Sirmium from the Gepids. So between 568 and 582, Sirmium was the point for the struggle between Byzantium and the Avars. However, we have mention of other Avar attacks on the Byzantine Balkan provinces. And after the rise to the Byzantine throne of Emperor Maurice in 582, and until the end of Maurice's reign in 602, namely in these 20 years, mostly the second part, from 592 to 602, is the peak of the Byzantine-Avar conflicts on the Balkans. What we have to mention also here is that the Slavic tribes of the lower Danube had often to choose an alliant in this great conflict. So some Slavic tribes were allies of the Avars, mostly what we read as Sklaveni, and the Antes, they kept their alliance of Byzantium since the era of Justinian. To the last mention about the Antes, we have by Theophylactus Simokates, dated in 602, the Antes are still referred as allies of Byzantium. And with this mention is linked to an Avar attack against the Antes. So if we consider in total these invasions, we could see briefly some measures that the Byzantine emperors took in order to be able to repel this, to affront these invasions. So we mentioned already about bridgeheads on the northern bank of the Danube, linked with bridges in some cases, so better communication and control of the northern bank of the lower Danube. The fortifications. Mentions about many emperors who tried to reinforce the Danubian limes, Constantine the Great, Valens, Theodosius, Arcadius, you see also in the 4th century, Theodosius II, 5th century, Anastasius I, Justin I, and mostly Justinian I, as we said. And also the archaeological finds brought to light more cases of fortifications than what we read in Procopius' buildings. Also, the so-called Limer Sarmaticus was a work of the 4th century going inside the Sarmatian territory. So it was a buffer zone, a front line of defense before these people attacked to the main defensive line, the Danubian limes. Fortifications mostly to confluence of rivers, because it was crossing points. It was one case where it's a case where we remark density of fortifications to the confluence of rivers. the conclusions of the so-called Fedus, a kind of alliance with the barbarians in order to have good relations. Namely, Byzantium offered them land for settlement and yearly payments and used these barbarians as troops for the campaigns of the Byzantine army. We have Fedus with the Goths twice, with Constantine the Great and Theodosius I. Later, Anastasius settled another German tribe, the Heruls, to northwestern Balkans, around Bassiana and Sigidunum, renewed this treaty with Justinian. Also, although they did not practice raids against Byzantium, Gepids and Lombard were also settled as federates to northwestern Balkans, part of Illyricum. Many other small or greater people inside or outside the Balkans took this status of federates after the collapse of the Hunnic kingdoms. And it was an effort, as we said, after 454, after the Battle of Nedao. We continue also with some of these measures. So, without this specific kind of fedus, because one presupposition is land for settlement, payments, annual tribute to be away from the Byzantine territory with attacks some people like Kutrigurs, Utigurs, or Avars. Cultural diplomacy, Christianization, under Constantius, the Christianization of the Goths, Ulfila. He was sent to the Goths, the first bishop of Gothia. The Heruls, in 528, Justinian accepted in Constantinople the king of the Heruls, Grepes, his name, and along with the renewal of the agreement, as Anastasius did earlier, he baptized the king of the Heruls. And of course, apart from the many conflicts in the Balkans, part of the defensive policy was the expeditions north of the river. Let's say to affront the problem to its root. We have such operations in the 4th century against the Goths, mostly by Emperor Valens. Against the Slavs, Justinian sent Hilbudius, the general Hilbudius, who fell in 533 to a battle against the Slavs. Later in Morisera, the generals Priscus and Peter attacked against the Slavs north of the Danube. Also, great operation of General Priscus against the Avars in Tisa region, the Tisa River, I mean, in 599. And also some other measures supporting the inner administration, as well as the poor peasants of the Balkans who had to support with tax in kind, sometimes also by payment, the needs for the border troops on the Danube. So the Questura Exercitus, adding 2 Danubian provinces to other island provinces, obviously had as a target the economic support of the 2 Danubian provinces with many problems at this moment from 3 other more rich provinces. And as we said, for the poor peasants, sometimes exemptions of tax payments, because they could not afford anymore all this burden for the support of the troops on the lower Danube. Some consequences of the invasions. since their beginning, we examine here the 4th century, the flight of Byzantine populations, mostly to the south, looking for more safe areas to settle. And also safety provided the coastal cities on the Balkans, both to the east, to the Black Sea, as well as to the west, the Adriatic Sea, areas were later developed as the Byzantine theme of Dalmatia. So demographic changes caused these invasions at the beginning to the northwestern Balkans. Changes to the way of life, the model of the city's development and importance of the cities, as we have a retreat, collapse of the urban life of Roman type. Apart of the invasions, other phenomena like epidemics, the transfer of population made a situation very difficult, and changes came as a result, as the outcome of these negative events. We have not so often the great and very strong economically urban centers of the Roman era, but now smaller cities with stronger fortifications as the attacks are very often. Also movement of populations from the city to the country and also to mountain shelters to have more safety from the invasions. The phenomenon of ruralization, so retreat of trade and the increase of the peasants and stock breeders, elimination of trade activity. But in any case, both in the cities as well as the country, the finds of the 6th century, mostly of the second half of the 6th century, are more and more poor comparing with earlier times. And the support, even the support of the border troops became more and more difficult because as the country was often devastated and the peasants were obliged to migrate, it was more and more difficult, the collection of the so-called annona militaris, a taxing kind for the border troops, and also the distribution of annona. We have concealment of numismatic hoards, and an exception to this rule, but till the early 7th century, because from about 610, 15, also the coastal cities of the Black Sea show a different, they have a different icon as earlier. They are also in poverty. And finally, finally to close this presentation, the final outcome of these barbarian invasions was the collapse of the Danubian limes. I don't say that the barbarian invasions was the only reason for this. We mentioned economic parameters and other, but of course the barbarian invasions gave the final blow to the early Byzantine organized defensive line along the lower Danube, known as limes. So we have a gradual fall from west to the east. When speaking about the lower Danube, we mean the part between Sigidunum and the Danube Delta, the estuaries of the river to the Black Sea. And between this part, we have the frontier of 4 early Byzantine provinces. So the 2 of them to the western part, Mesia Prima and Ripuaria and Dacia, the limes at these 2 provinces fell in circa 596 to 98, along with the last bridgeheads. Exceptions to the rule was cities as Sigidunum and Viminacium, some very important and strong cities that remained for some years more to the hands of the Byzantines. Mesia Prima, the limes to Mesia Prima fell likely in the era of Emperor Phocas, 602-610, and the last province to the east, modern Dobruja, the Scythia Minor. The Scythian limes fell likely in the first years of Emperor Heraclius, likely circa 614, with the exception of coastal cities, Tomis, Kistria, Calatis, the ports namely of the Black Sea. They survived for about 15 to 20 years more. And on the other hand, between 620 and 30 fell the Byzantine Dalmatia, to the exception of some cities and islands, which the Byzantines managed to keep under their control. And also I mentioned some siege of Thessaloniki by Slav Savars, and finally that of Constantinople in 626, which marked at least the end of the Avar threat for the Byzantines. Thanks for your attention, and I'm ready to hear your questions.
How do we applaud? Do we knock on the table?
We can applaud.
We will miss that. We will miss that in the virtual world. I mean, we will miss the applause after the talk, but we will have to get used to it. Thank you very much. So, Angeliki, please.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, Γιώργο. Να είσαι καλά. Χαιρόμαστε που σε έχουμε μαζί μας στη σειρά διαλέξεων τα Βαλκάνια ανάμεσα στις αυτοκρατορίες και που είσαι ο πρώτος που ανοίγει αυτόν τον κύκλο των διαλέξεων. Θα παρακαλούσα τον Γιώργο Θεοτόκη να ανοίξει τη συζήτηση. Απλά όσον αφορά τους φοιτητές από τους δικούς μας, να ξέρουν ότι μπορούν να κάνουν ερωτήσεις και στα ελληνικά στον ομιλητή. Θα τις μεταφράζουμε εμείς για να μπορούν να μετέχουν όλοι.
Αν τις ακούω στα ελληνικά, μάλλον δεν θα χρειαστώ μεταφράστη.
Εσύ όχι. Αλλά για τους υπόλοιπους που παρακολουθούν.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giorgos. So, just to open the discussion in English as well, we just informed the students of the Greek students who will join us, who have joined us.
Γιώργο, λίγο πιο δυνατά, δεν σε ακούω δυνατά.
Can you hear me now, Makute?
Yeah, yes, now
okay.
Much better.
Okay. So I will just repeating, what Angeliki said in Greek, that students in Greek will be able to ask questions in Greek to Giorgos, but whoever has any questions, the floor is yours, and you're welcome to grill Giorgos in matters of Byzantium and the barbarians in the Balkans. So we will take, let's take the first question, please. You can either ask for the floor or you can write it here in the chat, whichever is better for you.
May I have a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you